So, good morning. Today I'm going to talk about visualization, analysis, and design. This is actually also the title of a book I've written lately where I tried to distill, as Ian mentioned, I've been doing Viz for about the last 25 years. And I spent 5 or 6 years trying to say, so what do we know as a field? How can I explain how to think about visualization in a unified way? So this talk is actually going to be the itsy-bitsy bite-sized version of that. We've got about an hour. In fact, we have more time than I thought we did. I originally was going to talk for 50 minutes and then have 10 minutes of questions at the end. And the organizer said, actually, take the whole 60 minutes since you'll be around all day to take questions. So I actually have 3 endings. There's the ending I originally planned on, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then quite a bit more, and we'll see how much we get through. So think Lord of the Rings or John Scalzi's Red Shirts. We'll see how far we get. Certainly at least to, I bet, my second ending. We'll see. So having said all that, let's launch in. So defining of terms. Visualization. My own favorite definition of Viz, and I'm going to say Viz for the next hour so I don't have many, many syllables. So computer-based Viz systems provide visual representations of data sets designed to help people carry out tasks more effectively. So what's so interesting about this particular definition? Why, for example, is it crucial to have data and people in the same sentence? Now, in some sense, I'm teaching to the choir. If you didn't care about Viz, you wouldn't be here. But I still think it's actually useful to articulate what are some of the use cases of when we would use Viz and when we wouldn't. So I think Viz is suitable if you're not trying to replace a person, but instead to augment them. And so what are some of those cases? Well, if you've got something completely automatic and everyone that matters trusts it, then you're set and you don't need Viz. So when is that not the case? For one thing, there's a lot of analysis problems where if you knew exactly the question, of course you could write a program to solve it, but what if there's 100 questions possible, or 1,000 or 10,000 questions, and you're not sure which of them you're actually asking yet until you get some sense of the data? So when might this be the case? The classic long-term use case for Viz is that you design a system that many people will use for the indefinite future. And in some sense, exploratory analysis of scientific data is the classic example of that. So what other use cases are there? Well, instead of using it for discovery, there's using it for presentation of results that you already know, the classic New York Times case, which I'm sure a lot of you actually might have used as a conduit for knowing about D3 and caring about it. There's a couple other interesting cases. There's you want to automate it, but you're not there yet. And so you're using the Viz as a way to understand the data better, hopefully in the spirit of coming up with some model. You might even be halfway there. You might be in the middle of developing something automatic and need Viz as a way to try to help you understand as a developer. So Viz aimed at the developer of the automatic solution rather than some eventual end user to refine and debug, maybe even to figure out some of your parameters. Or, interestingly, the people that have to hit the button to say go ahead and deploy that automatic system to help them monitor it and trust it, either pre-deployment or in some cases even post-deployment as it goes on to make sure it's doing something reasonable. So having said all that, then why have this idea of a visual representation? That's one of a larger class of ways to externally represent data. That is, external to your own head. So the play here typically is anytime we can, we want to replace a cognitive act with a perceptual act. So let me give you an example. Here's a number, a table of numbers. These happen to be gene expression levels, but really they could be any numbers. And if I tell you, and actually, let me check, can people actually see these numbers at all? Sort of, not really. It's not crucial for my point. The point would be that if what you have to do is try to figure out what's the distribution of this set of numbers, roughly how many are above 0 versus negative. The problem is not that you can't read numbers. I have faith. Everyone in this room can read a number. So you read a number, and you store it in your head, and you read the next number, and you store that in your head, and at some point, we start running out of space in our heads to store those numbers in order to do this kind of comparison. And so it's actually a lot of small cognitive acts that all gang together into running out of internal memory space. If instead I encode this data visually, in this case I've actually done a color coding using a diverging red-green color scale, then suddenly you can start to see, oh, this happens to be gene expression levels over time. On the top, it's one condition. On the bottom, it's another condition about whether it got treated by a particular drug. And what you can notice is as you go along, the left pairs are pretty similar. Then they're also pretty similar. And then in that third time step, we see quite a divergence where there's more green on top and more red on the bottom. And we can start to say, oh, that experimental treatment actually affected the behavior of these genes. The point is, that's a lot of numbers that you would have been required to read and store in your head. But we're swapping out cognition with perception because we have a lot of parallel processing powers built into our brains in a way that we do not have to cognitively invoke to see these kinds of patterns. Okay. What's another reason why it matters to represent the data set in detail? Why can't we just use statistical summaries? Because after all, these are very powerful instruments. And the argument typically is they are incredibly powerful and we are going to use them a lot. But in many cases, a single static summary isn't sufficient because, by definition, a summary loses information. And often the details do matter. And if you want to confirm what you expect and also check for unexpected things, and particularly to check for the stat model you're running, does this really reflect the patterns of the data? It's nice to think about that. So let me do a poll of this room, and I'm curious. How many have seen Anscombe's quartet before? And how many have not? Okay, so for those of you who have not, it's a very fun data set, actually 4 small data sets designed by a statistician Anscombe in the early 70s with identical mean and variance and X and Y and correlation. And the point is, as soon as you look at the pictures as a human, you see that these are not the same data set. They have the same summary. One is a very typical one. One's got a clearly nonlinear model. Of course, you can have stats that cover the nonlinear models, but you have to know when is it worth using. We've got our regression line not quite right, and then a pessimal case there where our regression line is actively misleading. The point is, of course, this is a tiny data set and it's a toy data set, but life only gets worse. So that's 20 points. What about when we have 10,000 or 1 million? That's a static data set. What about when it's dynamic and changing over time? That's a small table. What about when you have a complex set of tables and networks and spatial data all linked together? So life can only get worse from here. There's reasons we need to have a human in the loop to check the data in all those cases I talked about at the beginning. So the way I've been thinking about Viz these days is through 4 different levels of design asking 3 questions. So let me walk you through those because I use those as sort of a cognitive shorthand for how I like to think. So we'll start out by saying, well, what's the domain situation? And by that I mean, who are the target users? What do they know? What is their vocabulary? Why are they looking at this data set? What are they bringing to the table in terms of data? Now, what's interesting about that is there's a lot of people who need Viz. Now, here's what's tricky. How is it that we can do something reasonable for the chemist and the financial analyst and the biologist and the physicist and the person looking at their personal music listening histories in a way that's in any way unified across them? And the answer is that we can't just use domain vocabulary to talk about their problems. They might use some really different words to talk about what at some deep intrinsic level from a Viz point of view is the same thing. And that's why what we really need to do is translate from a domain-specific way of talking about data and tasks to something that is in the vocabulary of the building blocks that we know how to use for visual representation. So one thing is we want to think about what is being shown. I'm going to call that the data abstraction. Now, here's what makes it tricky. Only in the easy case do people hand you a data set and you draw the picture. The very common case is that you somehow transform that data into a new form such that that form, when you draw the picture, actually helps them. So it's not just about mapping the data into abstract terms. It's quite possibly about transforming that data. And then the question is, why are they looking at that? We also need to abstract in this way for the task. And that task can guide us in the data transformation, because it's always the combination of tasks and data that you need to consider when thinking about a Viz. After all, there's many possible pictures, so which one do you pick? There's some guidance there from the task. Now, I'm going to call the idiom level. You might have heard these called techniques or methods or approaches or ways or stuff. But I'm specifically calling it an idiom. I want people to focus on the question of how are you showing the data. And I'm going to often distinguish between 2 cases. One is the visual encoding idiom. How do you draw that picture? And then there's the interaction idiom. How do you manipulate that picture? Now, in some cases, idioms are so intertwined between the visual encoding and the interaction that you can't necessarily separate them. In other cases, it's pretty clear which of the two they are. And then there's the algorithm level. And that's the level of design where we think about computing efficiently. Now, the reason that I think it's useful to divide the world up into these 4 levels is it helps me, and I think a lot of other people, think. It also helps you figure out, when am I done? When did I do it right? Are they actually getting what I wanted them to get? Because the thing about these different levels is there's dramatically different ways to screw up at each of these levels. So the way you can get it wrong at the domain level is you could misunderstand what people need. And the way you could get it wrong at this abstraction level is you might not have picked the right data abstraction, and that means that no matter how perfect your visual encoding is, they won't actually get it. So you might be showing them the wrong thing. And then at the idiom level, the way to get it wrong is that the way you show it doesn't work, and that's typically about things having to do with the human perceptual system. And then finally, your threat at the algorithm level is you might have terribly slow code. These are very different kinds of threats. And so it turns out that you really need to use radically different methods in terms of scientific background to try to figure out whether you did it right at each of these 4 levels. And that's actually what motivated me to split things up in this particular way. So the solution is you typically have to think, I'm not actually going to walk us through this whole diagram in detail, but I just want to walk through a few things. Let's actually start in the middle of this cascading nested model. So at the algorithm level, the way you figure out is your code fast enough. These are methods that anyone in here from a computer science background probably has in pretty good shape. So we can do computational benchmarks. We're measuring the system time and memory. If you're more theoretically inclined, maybe you analyze computational complexity. So these are methods that computer science departments typically do a pretty good job of training folks at. Okay, so what else is there? This is where we typically, in some cases, visualization is exactly focused on this question. Here's a new algorithm to do something typically faster, better, more scalably. I'm going to call that technique-driven work. And that's one of the flavors of Viz. Now, what about trying to validate at this idiom level? Did I pick the right encoding and interaction idioms? Often, to try to figure that out, it's a design problem to say, of all the possibilities I have, and we'll be talking our way through some of these possibilities today, which of these is a reasonable choice, given what I know about the trade-off space? And often to try to figure out, did I get it right, this is the time you can actually do experiments on humans in a lab. And you're still measuring time, but you're measuring how long a human took to perform the task in a pretty abstracted setting in a lab where you're actually doing experiments. Or you might just be talking qualitatively about the result images you get and making arguments about why this method might be better than that method. So that's for the idiom level. Now, what about that abstraction and domain situation levels? How can you figure out what people actually need? Now, in this case, we often need methods out of a different area. Instead of that cognitive psychology lab experiment, we often want methods out of ethnography and anthropology, of observing humans and figuring out when a technological intervention actually changes the kinds of things they do. And then in that case, it's often really interesting to deploy your system to real users and watch them use it. I'm going to call that field study as a method. Because one thing that a lot of people get wrong is they try to figure out if their new thing is better using methods at the wrong level. So if you want to convince me that your new idiom is good, then don't tell me how fast the computation runs. We have to figure out if humans can use it. So there's a mismatch with computational benchmarks being used to validate idioms. Now, a lab study is great to validate idioms, but if you want to convince me that you really understand what the users need, you won't convince me by showing me a lab study, because the part where you're watching people do something and timing them with a stopwatch, you told them what to do as the experimenter. You gave them the task. If you want to see if you got the task abstraction right, that's why field study methods where they use their own data and do what they like and you see how they work is typically a better method. So trying to get these matches and mismatches straight is one way that it can help you think about these different levels of design. Now, I'm often going to call problem-driven work where people start out with real users and real data and real problems and try to go through and then do that abstraction, figure out which idioms are good. Maybe you don't have to invent a new idiom. There's a lot of idioms out there. Your choice as a designer is to pick the appropriate one for the setting. And then if you need to, you can also do some algorithmic work to do something that's faster or better than people had proposed before. So that kind of starting from the problem, working towards the user, I'm going to call problem-driven work. And a lot of Viz is one of these two, of either starting with a problem or starting with an algorithmic idea. They're both fun. In my lab, we tend to do a lot of both. I find it useful to go back and forth between these. So why is it useful? I know, obviously, I'm an academic. Not everyone in this room is an academic. In fact, probably a lot of you aren't. So why is this sort of analysis something that I think is worth doing? And it's because I think it imposes structure on this design space that's otherwise completely overwhelming. So I think of it as some kind of scaffold to help you think systematically about the full set of choices that are available to you, with the logic that it's useful to analyze existing systems to help you design a new one more effectively or faster or better. So just to give you an example, before I start walking through anything, I'm just going to throw you into the deep end with an example of looking at two different systems to visualize trees. Space trees from Maryland, tree juxtaposers from my own lab. And if you just look at the pixels, some pretty different things are going on the screen here. But what's interesting is if we try to go under the hood a bit and think, so what's happening here? These are actually, I'm going to posit that these are both being used for the same task. So we've got tree data. This is a large tree of evolutionary relationships between species. So that's for the what. For the why, the idea is they're trying to locate a particular path that's the least common ancestor of two animals. So we're trying to find a path between two nodes and identify that out of all the other paths. And then where they differ is the how. How are they doing this? So with both space tree and tree juxtaposer, well, we're visually encoding data. That's pretty basic, otherwise we wouldn't be drawing this picture. They both have some support for navigating through the scene and for selecting some items. And then here's where they diverge. Because with space tree, after you've selected something, a lot of the data is filtered out completely and not shown. And a lot of the data is aggregated. That's what these little pyramid shapes are underneath, showing you roughly what's the size of the tree that was left out. Now with tree juxtaposer, in contrast, when you select an area, there's this stretch and squish navigation metaphor where some of the tree is expanded and then the rest is compressed to make room. So the spatial rearrangement of the links and nodes changes. It's an arranging question. So what's interesting about this is we can then start to see where are the differences and similarities, not just at the level of pixels drawn on the screen, but at the level of the intended task and the set of methods that are used. And so that's what I'm going to emphasize today, is to help you think a bit about this design space. So let's start out with the what. I'm going to put up some big intimidating looking diagrams and then say, don't worry, we're only going to walk through a bit of these because we have finite time today. So of this diagram, what do I think is the most crucial? Well, thinking about the type of data that you have. So in terms of data set types, I like to think in terms of a holy trinity. There's really three basic types of data. There's tables and networks and spatial data. And so in all of these cases, you can have attributes. I'm often going to think, table is the easy case to think about, where I'll think about the rows in the table as items. I'll call the columns in the table attributes. There's a lot of synonyms for these. Some people call them attributes or variables or dimensions. And the key thing, and you might have complex multidimensional tables where you actually have multiple keys to look things up in the table. Now, in the case of a network, the difference between is you don't just have items, you have relationships between items. And in that case, sometimes we call those item nodes, and then we call that relationship a link. And in the case of spatial data, we've actually got spatial position. And in some sense, you might just think of that as an attribute, but it's an attribute so special, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, that it actually really matters whether or not we have spatial position. And there's two different flavors of that. There's spatial fields. Just to check about how the projector's working, can people actually see those thin gray lines that form the grid there, or is that pretty washed out? Okay, well, take my word that there are in fact thin gray lines. Sorry that that's not quite so visible as it might be. But what I'm trying to show is the idea that the data might be sampled regularly in space, and that at every point in space you're taking perhaps some measurements, or if in the case of a simulation, But there's also this idea of attributes, but sampled in regular spatial positions. Or you might even just have shape data, geometric spatial data, like in this case of the outlines of a country. And this actually gets at a point which I think is worth thinking about for a second, which is, what's the difference between visualization and computer graphics? Computer graphics is where we've got some idea that we are making a synthetic picture of the world. So my own dividing line between graphics and viz is whether there's a choice on the part of the designer about what to show. So in the case where you have something like the geometric shape of a country, in fact, cartographers have been struggling with hundreds of years about these issues involved in the choice of what to actually draw at the end of the day, even though you have some given shape information. So if the designer is making a choice about what to show, even with spatial data, that's where I think of it as a viz problem, as opposed to simply taking a computational description of a scene and creating an image from that, which is what I think about as the problem of computer graphics. So having talked about these big three, tables, networks, and spatial data, there's a point I want to make about attributes, which is something that all three of these have, which are typically the things you're trying to visualize. And that's whether or not you actually have quantitative or non-quantitative, I'll call them categorical attributes. So with a categorical attribute, what you're seeing is there is a difference between these. These are apples, these are oranges, these are bananas. In contrast, if you've got data that implicitly has an ordering within it. So, for example, the case a lot of people are familiar with is quantitative data. I can talk about measuring something like the length of this microphone. I can say, well, this microphone's about 12 inches long. I might have a shorter microphone that's about 6 inches long, and I can do math on that. I can say 12 minus 6 is 6 inches, and that is a meaningful number. Sometimes we need to think about data that has an order, yet you can't do that kind of arithmetic on it. My favorite example is t-shirt sizes. Everyone agrees that a medium t-shirt falls between a large and a small t-shirt, but it is not defined what a large minus a medium t-shirt means, right? That's an undefined quantity. So sometimes I'll care about the distinction between ordered and quantitative, between ordinal and quantitative. Sometimes I don't care so much and I just think about them together as ordered data versus the unordered categorical data. And I'll be coming back to why I insist on this as a really crucial fundamental question with your data. Is it ordered or not? So that was our whirlwind tour through the land of what. Now let's go in a tiny bit more detail through the land of why. Why are you looking at data in a vocabulary that's independent of any particular domain? So let's actually step through this a bit. Before we step through, what I want you to notice is just that there's a big column on the left, actions, and a big column on the right, targets. And if you start reading through descriptions of visualization, you'll often see these these action target pairs. So phrases like discover a distribution, or compare trends, or locate outliers, or browse topology. These are these action target pairs. So let's think first about the actions and then the targets. So there are three pretty independent questions that you can consider. So I'm going to step through one of these at a time. So in the case of how are you analyzing, one of those cases is that you are consuming existing data. So I already mentioned the dichotomy between discovery and presentation, a very classic split. And for discovery, there's often even a split within that of generate new hypotheses versus verify existing hypotheses. And if you're not feeling scientific, maybe you call them hunches, guesses. The point is, are you trying to figure out whether you were right, or are you trying to guess new things? Sometimes these are called things like exploration versus explanation. Now there's this interesting third use case that's getting to be more popular, and in particular with a lot of the uses of D3, it's not your day job to analyze this data, but you're not just consuming what somebody has already figured out. You're analyzing this data because it's fun. Casual use, maybe it's your own personal data, maybe it's other people's data that you're curious about. So this enjoyment case is an interesting third one. There's less about it in the academic literature, but there is in fact starting to be some about that as well. So those are all cases of you're taking data that exists and visualizing it. How about when you're making new data along the way as part of the visualization? Now it could be that you're annotating something. You're taking some structures and adding information to it. You might be recording a viz session, maybe to play back later, either for purposes of presentation or reproducibility, to remind yourself what you did, what's the provenance of what you found. Or here's this third case, where you're deriving new data along the way for the purposes and goals of the visualization itself. This is actually a really crucial case. And I'm going to go back to that idea I mentioned that for the data abstraction, you might not just draw what you're given, you might transform the data along the way. And that's what I mean by this derive case. You're producing something from what you got that's not quite the same. So that's important enough I actually want to give it its whole own slide to think about this. Don't just draw what you're given, think about what the right thing to show is. And you often have either one or a series of transformations to do that, and then that's what you draw. This is one of the 4 major strategies for handling complexity of data, and we'll be talking through the other 3 soon. So here's the classic example, back to Playfair, some of the original abstract data visualized. If you have imports versus exports, you can look at these 2 lines and try to figure out what the difference between those is, and there's actually a fair amount of cognition in that, and because of the way our perceptual system works, we're not totally fantastic at this task. If instead you, the viz designer, say, aha, I could subtract these 2 and then graph that new quantity that I have just derived, in this case that's the trade balance, then you have a much more high precision way of actually understanding that data. So I'm guessing most of the people in this room have probably already seen this example. I'm curious, how many have actually seen this Playfair example? A fair number. Let's look at a slightly more complicated one, just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things you can do. This is the same idea, but in some ways in a slightly richer context. So what we're trying to do is say, well, we've got a node link graph or a tree, and what we want to do is show a skeleton of that tree, maybe because in this case, the tree is actually 500,000 nodes. Maybe we don't have a fantastic graphics card and we just want to render that at 30 frames a second quickly. How could we show a small number of nodes in that tree and get something reasonable? If you pick a random 5,000 nodes, like the first 5,000 nodes in the data file, and draw those, you will not see a meaningful skeleton. You'll probably see a strange collection of things. So we can say, okay, let's derive some new data. Let's take that tree and compute some kind of centrality metric on it. The particular one I'm showing here is called the Strahler number. It was invented by hydrogeographers to show the structure of rivers going through and see how streams and tributaries connect. And so it's a way to say how central is a node in a network. You go through, it's actually quite a complex global calculation that I'm not going to get into the details of. But so using the entire structure of that tree, you're going to calculate a quantitative attribute for every node in the original tree. And that's a deriving step. And I'm going to think of a series of chained tasks where I first derive this new attribute on the nodes. And then in a second step, I'm going to say, I'm going to use that as a filter criterion. And I'm going to filter and take the top 500 most important nodes in that tree, or actually in this case, 5,000. And once I filter away, and that's what I'm showing on the right here, I've got a color coding designed to just help you see what the connection between those trees are with the breadth-first encoding, then what you've got is a pretty good skeleton of that tree at a very small drawing cost. So this is a slightly more involved example, but it's the same basic idea. Derive new information along the way as you need it, often as the first task in a chained sequence, in order to actually draw something more meaningful or useful to the user if you have limits. And there are always limits. There's limits not just on computational power, not even just on the human attention span, but also on the number of pixels you have at a time. Pixels are one of your most precious resources, and you run out of them almost instantly. And a huge number of your complexity reduction strategies are to deal with the fact that you've got a finite pixel budget as a designer. So let's think about a different question. What does the user know about the data? And the words searching and finding and exploring are often used in pretty interchangeable ways that actually cover some pretty different cases. So sometimes it's useful to think about both the target of the search in terms of an item and its location. So if you know what you're looking for and you know where it is, let's just call that a lookup case. So particularly if you're, say, finding a word in a dictionary and you know they're in alphabetical order, it's just a matter of looking things up. Well, what about the case where you know what you're looking for but you don't know where it is? Let's say you've got a node link graph laid out in space. You can't just look up the node for, say, wombat. You have to actually find that. It's not in some kind of alphabetical ordering. Let's call that locate. And it's interesting to think about the flip side of that. What if you don't necessarily know what you're looking for, but you know a neighborhood that might be fruitful to look in? Let's call that the browse case. Why is it interesting to browse in a physical bookstore? It's because a human, the bookstore staff, has actually put things in a useful order where there are sub-neighborhoods of interest, like the gardening section versus the science fiction section. If those books were randomly stacked up in the bookstore, browsing would not be a fun experience. You as the Viz designer are doing something similar, where anytime you want to support browsing, you have to have a meaningful layout of space that the user thinks might actually help them find things of interest near other things. So some idea of neighborhood similarity. And then once you have this tricky case, well, you don't really know what you're looking for, and you most certainly don't know where it is, that's what I'm calling explore, as in some sense the hardest of these 4 cases to deal with, and the situation where the user needs the most support from the system to find things of interest, to have some kind of information sent to hunt down things that could be good to look at. Now, let's also think about a last question of how much of the data do they need to answer their question? Are they at the end of the day trying to get down to identifying one thing out of everything you're seeing? Or is the task something that involves comparison between a few different alternatives? Typically, finding something through browsing is necessary but not sufficient for when you're comparing a few things to each other in detail. Or do they actually need to summarize the whole data set so they're looking for something that's showing them about all of the data? So, or possibly summarizing some chosen subset of the data. So it's a question about, are they looking for one thing or comparing a few things or really needing a summary of all? And it's very frequent that you start out in a visualization of showing them an overview summarizing all of the data so that they have some idea of where to start. So these 3 questions of analyzing, searching, and querying, you can have independent answers for each of these 3. So think of it as sort of a combinatorial possibility of the kinds of actions that people need to take. And notice how these are all in very domain-independent ways of thinking. Now, this is not a complete set. There may well be more verbs you need if you think about actions as verbs. But it's a start on ways to think about it in a way that is not domain-specific. So what about the target side? Actions are verbs, targets are nouns. What are the nouns that we're acting on here? So some of the things really apply for pretty much any data set. Looking for trends, finding outliers. I'm using the word features as a general domain-independent way of saying essentially anything that you can somehow identify as being something specific. You could try to encapsulate as a feature and show that. Now, there's some questions that you ask which are about these attributes, and some are about one single attribute. So the really classic case is you're trying to understand the distribution of values within an individual attribute. Sometimes you just need those extreme min-max values. But there's some questions that have to do with attributes that are intrinsically about comparing attributes to each other. Is there a dependency between them? Are 2 attributes correlated to each other? Is there some similarity metric that you can use to analyze them? Now, all 3 of those data sets I talked about have this idea of attributes, so tables and networks and spatial data. There are some targets that only make sense for certain kinds of data. And so the classic thing is if you've got a network, then the topological structure of that network, the topology, is typically the thing you're asking about. If you're bothering to draw the network, it's because they somehow need to trace its topology or trace a path between things. The other question that's very data specific is what is the shape of spatial data? So a lot of questions about spatial data come down to understanding its shape, and I'm really emphasizing that as a task for spatial data because if you have non-spatial data where the designer chooses the spatial position of things, then the shape is up to the designer. It's not intrinsic in the data itself. Whereas for spatial data, if you use that spatial data to lay it out, then what you are supporting is them understanding that shape. So that was quite a blitz through why and what, and the rest of this talk, as long as we have time for today, will be about this question of how. How do you show these things? What is the vocabulary of visualization? So let's start with the left part of that diagram. How can you encode information specifically? You have choices about arranging data in space and mapping different channels of information as a way to encode data given that spatial structure. Now, let's take a step back and think, if we want to analyze this in terms of the structure of these idioms, how can we do it? So what we have bar charts, we have scatter plots. You might know the names for these. How can we systematically think about them? And the way is going to be something that probably everyone in this room is at least some level of familiar with. We're going to think about the idea of marks and channels, and D3 is deeply based on this mark channel way of seeing the world. So when I say mark, I'm going to mean a geometric primitive. It could be a zero-dimensional point, a one-dimensional line, two-dimensional area. In fact, it could actually be a 3D volume, although that's not quite as common of a case in non-spatial data. So what can you do with the mark? You can encode information by controlling its appearance with what I'm going to call channels. So that's spatial position, whether it's horizontal, vertical, or both of them together, its color, its shape, its size, its orientation. Size could be the one-dimensional length, the two-dimensional area, the three-dimensional volume. So once you can then think about this idea of marks and channels that control their appearance, then you can go back and analyze a lot of visual encodings with this basic combination of marks and channels. And so you can say things like, a bar chart is using the vertical position channel, and it's using the mark type of a line, and that's how it's encoding data. What about a scatter plot? Well, that's separately using vertical and horizontal position. We've swapped now from a line mark to a point mark. And then we can continue encoding more attributes by, say, adding color to the mix, and then adding a size coding, so that's an area coding to the mix. And so now we're using two spatial dimensions and two non-spatial dimensions channels to encode this data. So the question you might want to ask is, first of all, so these channels, how many channels are there? And the short answer is lots. There are many ways to encode information. So how do you choose between them? And this is where I'm going to come back to the question we talked about a minute ago, which is, what kind of attribute are you showing? There's the Jock-McKinley's expressiveness principle of trying to match the characteristics of the data to the characteristics of the visual channel. And this slide is split into two regions, the left side and the right side, for a reason. And that reason is that some of these channels are intrinsically ordered by your perceptual system, whether you like it or not. So everything on the left is what I'm going to call a magnitude channel that implicitly tells your perceptual system that there is an order to things. So that includes things like spatial position along a common scale, length, orientation, area, color. We'll talk a bit about how color is subdivided, but things like luminance and saturation are ordered channels. In contrast, on the right here, I've got different visual channels that are appropriate for categorical attributes. So if you think about the left as the how much questions, then the right is the what questions, identity. So what region is it in? What color is it, green or blue or red? What motion is something moving through? What shape is it? So you want to match, because if you show unordered data with an ordered channel, then of course you are showing information that's not there. And the flip side is if you have ordered information that you encode with an unordered channel, you're losing information along the way. So you're violating this expressiveness principle. One more principle for this slide. These are actually from top to bottom in an order on purpose, and it means something. So thinking about the effectiveness of a channel, they are not all created equal. If you have some idea of the importance of your attributes, you want to use these high-ranked channels to encode the more important things. These are actually ordered from best to worst. Now, if we had a lot longer, and we'll see how much longer we have at the end, we can get into some of the reasons why. There are, decades, actually at this point, centuries of research about why it is that some of these channels are more accurately perceived than others. For now, we're going to see how much we have time for later, but you can just take it on faith that at the top of the higher ones, notice how things involving spatial position and spatial region are near the top for both of them. So spatial position is a really, really important channel. And then we have others as well, including color and size and orientation and so on. But what I want to do, because we do have finite time, is actually jump ahead a bit. And instead of focusing a lot on the visual encoding at the beginning, which I think is the things that are most familiar to you, particularly because of the structure of D3, which is a very mark and channel based way of viewing the world. So given that you've already probably thought a fair amount about marks and what you can do with them, I'm going to actually jump to the other side of this diagram for the beginning of this. and think about what are some other ways besides directly visually encoding data that you can deal with complexity. So there's 3 more strategies for dealing with complexity, in addition to that previous one I mentioned before, which was deriving new data. So at some point, there's always, you want to visually encode the data, but what if you can't show it all at once? And so these strategies are that you might have a view that changes over time. That's interactivity, any kind of dynamic change. You might split the data, facet it across multiple views. You might reduce the amount of data that you show in any single view, whether that's with filtering or aggregation or some other way of doing it, in addition to that deriving of new data. So if you think about these as 4 major strategies for handling complexity, let's just walk through them a bit to think about them. So I'm going to start with the one that's both the most obvious and the most flexible, and it's very powerful, this idea of any kind of change over time. So interaction. As an example of interaction, any kind of dynamic change, let me mention animated transitions as a nice one that we know a fair amount about as viz folks, which is that if you want to change your visual encoding from one state to another, whether that's actually changing the way you encode the data or having some kind of navigation state where you're conceptually either moving the camera or changing what's being seen, then an alternative to a jump cut where you go straight from one to another, the problem with jump cuts is it's hard to track objects between. You actually have to reacquire the position of the different objects. So if you want to track the items between, it can be really useful to show things gradually along the way, where what I'm actually showing you is a multi-level matrix for showing software project structure. And we've taken that small blue square in the middle, and we're gradually expanding it to fill up the whole screen while compressing the sides and the top and bottom as we go. And then what happens, so on the left side, they've actually selected the high salary players. That's showing log-scaled salary data. So if you pay them a lot of money, what do we see? It's actually pretty distributed across the years and pretty distributed across the positions that the baseball players are playing, and even in the distribution of who gets other people out. But it's over on the right side of the graph showing how many hits per year people get. So good. The high-paid people are actually hitting the ball a lot. This matches my deep knowledge of baseball. Let's look on the right. So what they've done is structured where they've grabbed the bottom part of that scatter plot of people that get other people out a lot. And look at that, it's pretty distributed across the salary range and across the junior and senior players, but it's not at all equally distributed across the positions because only some positions are in a place to actually tag people out a lot. So not a super deep analysis of baseball, but my point here is to actually get you thinking, what is the point of linked highlighting across views? And it's to understand different spatial distributions between either different data or different visual encodings. So along those lines, let's think, what's another way to have multiple views? So any kind of a bird's eye map where you've got some kind of overview of everything versus a detail view, and maybe one of those is smaller than the other, in this case it's the overview that's small, you've got the same visual encoding across the views, but you're showing a subset of the data in one compared to the other. So these are another extremely common metaphor. We'll call this overview detail as an idiom, as a design choice. What's another thing we could do? Well, with small multiples, then we've got the same visual encoding, but the data is partitioned between the views so that they don't have any shared data. But the fact that they're using a similar visual encoding is what allows you to compare between them. Here's actually that same example that I showed at the beginning, which was multiple graphs showing interactions between genes where what's being color-coded is the results of a particular experiment. And it's the same spatial layout between all these windows, but the color coding changes, and that's how we're actually looking at information across these multiple views. And this also had shared bidirectional navigation between the views. Now let's take a minute to think about these possibilities of same or different visual encoding and all, some, or none of the data being shared between the views. And of those 6 cases, 2 are boring, and let me explain why. If you've got all the data is the same and the visual encoding is the same, you have identical views, it's redundant, and we are bored. If you've got all the data but the views are different, that was the term I was calling multiform, Notice how showing a subset of the data in one view versus another is very common, whether or not it's the same visual encoding or a different visual encoding. Those are both common. Small multiples are common, where you have none of the data shared, but the same encoding. And if you have no similarities of your data, and you have no similarities of your visual encoding, you can't link the views. They're too different. There's no points of connection. And so that's also not an interesting case. What is interesting is to think about when and why do we do this? What is the power of juxtaposing views side by side? And in slogan form, it's about eyes versus memory. So one of the slogans I have in the book is this idea that eyes beat memory. And what I mean by that is anytime you can have something done by the perceptual system versus internal resources, it's a win. And in particular here, what's happening is if you think about the cognitive load of comparing two views that are side by side that your eyes can just move between, to the cognitive load of remembering what you saw before internally compared to what you see now, it's actually lower cognitive load for those side-by-side views. And so the power of small multiples comes because you're not requiring internal use of memory. So if small multiples and other linked views are so fantastic, why do we do anything else but that? And the answer is we have really strong limits on this because every time you add a view, you steal pixels away from the other views, and your pixel budget is finite. And so there's a trade-off between the number of pixels you have available and that internal use of memory in a human. And a lot of the interesting design decisions are about the interplay between those. So you typically don't spawn a view every time you might do a minor change, but keep in mind that having people remember what they saw before is one of the failure points at some point of having changeable dynamic views over time. So a lot of systems use a combination of those two. Of course, you might have multiple views side by side, each of which can change. So this question of partitioning the data between the views, how do we do that? And more deeply, why do we do that? What is the perceptual property that we're using? And it turns out to go back to that picture I had of the channels and of spatial position. Because really what you're doing when you're partitioning data between views is you're saying that everything within one view is really related to each other compared to within another view. And that's because your brain automatically uses spatial proximity as an associational code about grouping. So the grouping happens first and foremost through these spatial patterns. So it's huge implications for what people notice based on how you divide things spatially between the views. And so typically you'll do this split based on attributes, and you've got a bunch of design choices. How many times do you split? Do you end up with a complex region or a simple mark within each region? What's the order that you split them in? How many views is the right number? The short answer is we don't know yet. Open research problem, more than 2, less than 100. Probably a lot less than 100. But there's a lot of trade-off questions that are still not fully understood, but we do understand some things. And so let's take a look at them, and let's use bar charts as a simple example. Here's something I stole from some of Mike's blocks. And it's useful because it lets us think about the simple case. What are we seeing on the left? Here we've got some of the US states. We've got some demographic information that's currently encoded by color. And what we do on the left is that we first split by the state. And then we stop. And we say, okay, here's a region of space for each state. And so what we do is we say, I can't encode all this information with a single mark. I'm going to use something more complex. I'll call that a glyph. So we've got a complex glyph, which in this case comes down to just being a grouped bar chart. And what's easy to do is compare patterns within each state. We can see, roughly these 6 states all have kind of the same pattern. You know, California's got some absolute numbers that are different. And then we can start to say within the state what's happening in terms of, we see this spike in population of the mid-range demographic. Now, how is that different than what we did on the right? On the right, we have small multiples. We started by splitting by the age attribute into regions. And then what we have in each region is a simple bar chart. And what's easy to do now is we can compare the distributions across the ages. It's not impossible to compare things between states, but it's harder. It's easy to compare within the age group. So the order we split this in had a strong effect on the patterns that we can easily see. So now let's bump this up a notch from bar charts to something a little more complex. Let's look at a fun data set of housing. This is not house prices in San Francisco, which are high, but rather London, which is one of the few places where they might be even higher. So let's first split by neighborhoods. So those of you who know your London neighborhoods, this is actually, they're being shown. And then we split by the type of whether it's a flat, an apartment, or terraced row housing, or semi-detached house, or full-on detached house. And then by the time, where the years are the rows and the months are the columns. And this is currently colored by the price of the house. So what can you see in this? You can spot the expensive neighborhoods, you know, a lot of those central ones. You can see where you pay a lot more for different types of houses, like a big disparity between what you pay for a flat versus what you pay for a house in some of these versus others. So that's analysis at the neighborhood level. What happens if we switch this? So now what I'm going to do is start by splitting it into the type of house, the flat versus semi-detached versus terraced row house versus detached house, and then within each of these we're splitting by neighborhood. And now we've also switched our coloring, we're looking at the price variation, and now what we see is that you can look at patterns where how inconsistent is it within each neighborhood based on already looking at the type. So the use case might be, you've already decided I'm going to buy, say, a flat, and I want to know where it's worth continuing to look. So it's supporting different kinds of questions. Now, in case you think this is all and only about rectilinear structures, this doesn't have to be just bar charts and boxes. Let's think about this case where we've got some recursive subdivision, but instead, after we divide this into the type of house, now we're going to show this geographically. Some of you might have actually noticed there's a relationship between what you see in this picture and in that picture. They were actually using a nice geographic weighting to try to have a quasi-geographic view, even in that abstract one, so that it's easier to go back and forth between the spatial position and the non-spatial position. And now what we have, instead of calling this a heat map, where we've got a box that's color-coded, technically we call this a choropleth map, but it's the same idea. We're color-coding now within these geographic shapes. So that gives you some sense of these questions of partitioning and faceting. Now, let's go back and take a quick look at these three more strategies of data reduction. So how do we reduce what's shown within a single view? Now, a classic example is we've got, and when I say reduce, I really mean either reduce or increase as inverses. So what's nice about filtering things out, first of all, it's easy to do and it's easy to explain. So it makes your computation easier in many cases. It's pretty straightforward to tell people what you've done to their display. But there's a fundamental problem, which is that out of sight, out of mind is not just a proverb, it's sadly a perceptual reality. Even if the user themselves hit that button 90 seconds ago to turn things off, it turns out you systematically start thinking about what you see as if it's the only thing that's there. So it's really hard to draw conclusions about the whole data set after you start filtering. Then typically you can only really concentrate on the parts that are being shown. What you could also do then is instead of simply throwing out information in the filter case, and you could filter either items or attributes, I'll mention, what about the aggregation case? You can have items where you have a proxy for a whole set of items that you're not showing. And what's nice is you've got some information about everything. What's tricky is, how do you do that? How do you avoid filtering out the signal you wanted to show when you do that aggregation? So the devil is in the details with aggregation. Powerful, tricky, and non-trivial. The one thing I also want to mention is these are not mutually exclusive. You can combine filtering and aggregating. And in fact, you can combine reducing and faceting and changing and deriving, and that's typically what people do in interesting complex data sets. I'm going to show you just a couple of super quick examples of aggregate because we're running low on time. And let me just mention box plots. Box plots are interesting because what they're doing is aggregating. It's a static way of showing the data, and it's supporting a find distribution task. And what's interesting is there's 5 carefully calculated numbers that are pretty good statistical summaries of data sets, and we're visually encoding these with a static visual encoding. I want to contrast this with something maybe a little more aggressive, which is how would you aggregate attributes, not items? And what's interesting about this is it doesn't matter if you have 100 items or 1,000,000 items, it takes the same amount of screen real estate to show these box plots, and that's why they have a lot of power. So in one last example, let's talk about aggregating attributes. What does that even mean? That means coming up with new synthetic dimensions to try to show something. And it's a nice example, coming back to where I started, of chaining through a series of tasks. So a really common case is that if you're trying to show a huge collection of documents, how would you show that? originally, if you think about a document as being something where you have a lot of words in it, and you can have a feature vector where for every document in the data set, you can say, did a word appear in that document or not, across the set of words that appear in all documents in the whole data set. And what do you get? A gigantic high-dimensional table. And should you draw that table directly? No. Impossible to understand and deeply boring. Very, very sparse. So what do we typically do? We aggregate. We come up with new synthetic dimensions where we can then, well, what do we want to do with those dimensions? After we've derived them, then we can show a scatter plot of the points in that new low-dimensional space. And what we're trying to see is, are there clusters? Is there a meaningful cluster structure? And if there is, maybe even we annotate that with labels. So I originally thought we might have time for our longer, more endings, but it turns out we're only get to our first ending. What we've gotten through is we've talked a little bit about what and a little bit about why. We've just actually scratched the surface of the hows. There's more to say. If folks are interested in more, there is a lot more in this book. If you're curious, the talk slides themselves are up. And also there's a lot of work we do in our own group that folks might find interesting that I basically didn't talk about pretty much at all today. So both my research group slide and my own slides. If folks are interested, there is a lot more, but this is what we have time for today. So I declare victory, and thanks for your patience.